We're going to look at VR and some of the related technologies around that. Um, oops, okay. Um, so very quick introduction. So I'm Tech. So I'm a senior solutions engineer at Unity Singapore. I've been at Unity like 3 years now, but I've been working essentially with the engine throughout most of my career, mostly in game development. So joining Unity was actually my first step outside of game development into more looking at more industrial and things like architectural, stuff outside of games, which has been pretty interesting. I spent most of my time as a technical artist in games. So I've gotten to look at a bunch of different technologies. I've worked with VR and AR in games prior to joining Unity. So it's a pretty vast field, and it's obviously it's a rapidly growing field right now. So today we're going to talk briefly about a few topics. What is VR? Kind of an intro to what it is, where it came from. We're going to talk about how it can be used. All the different use cases from gaming and outside. What kind of benefits you can see from using VR over perhaps other media. We're going to look at a little bit at some workflow and examples. Um, these workflow examples aren't going to they're not going to dive too deep. They're going to get too technical, but it'll give you a taste. And then we'll open up for some questions. So what is virtual reality? So in general, the sort of broad picture is that VR is the use of some sort of computer technology. It's usually a head-mounted display to fully immerse your users in a simulated environment. Now, this is actually something that's starting to get a bit blurry as far as the definition is concerned. Traditionally, we think of VR as something where you put on a headset, you block yourself out from the outside world. You see nothing of the outside world. You see a fully virtual environment, whether that's stylized or photorealistic, and you're fully immersed. You just see that. As Sean had mentioned, there's also this mixed reality stuff. There's been more and more sort of an increasing use of mixed reality pass-through technology to allow you to kind of blur the lines between AR and VR, right? So you've got a headset, you've got cameras that are showing you the outside world, but then you're also showing a virtual environment or virtual objects that are overlaid on top of the video feed that you're seeing. We'll talk a bit more about some of the advantages of this approach a little later on. But so one of the main, I guess, components of VR typically, especially now that it's kind of evolved, is you've got that headset. It's fully immersed. It's usually a fairly wide field of view compared to a monitor, and compared to some of the AR solutions that are currently out there. You'll typically also have some sort of motion tracked controller. These are tracked in different ways depending on the device, and sort of how far along they are on the technology tree. Sorry, I'm trying to get my notes. So a couple of the major players in the virtual reality space right now, at least in terms of market share and public visibility. You've got the HTC Vive. They're one of the sort of earlier major players. There's the Meta Quest now. Meta Quest 2, now that Oculus has kind of discontinued their wired headsets. And then you got PlayStation VR on the console side of things. So you're sort of looking at a relatively small set of major players. Then there are a bunch of, I want to say, smaller players in a sense, in terms of market share for the consumers. But there are a number of VR headsets that are geared towards enterprise solutions, construction, automotive, and these are going to be typically higher fidelity and a lot more expensive as well. So I talked about your controllers and your tracking and your headsets. Now, typically, you're looking at a number of different solutions to track both your controllers, and these might be handheld controllers or they might be your hands, as well as the headset. Now, initially, we sort of started off with inertial, like IMU sensors, and all these did was track your orientation. Right? They used an accelerometer to track whether you're facing a certain way or your head is tilted. And this was kind of interesting because when it started, we didn't have positional tracking, and there were all kinds of tricks that, especially like the Rift DK1, the Developer one, and like the Oculus Go, that would sort of trick you into thinking that your head was moving. So when you tilted your head, the camera itself would physically move in the environment, and so it would simulate that you're not just rotating the camera, but you're actually tilting your head. And so that they made a big difference in terms of the immersiveness, and also helped a little bit with motion sickness, which we'll talk about a little bit later, which is a big thing. So we also have so that was sort of the first gen of sort of tracking. Then we also have outside-in tracking, which is what we call outside-in tracking, which relies on external sensors. So things like, I think the Vive calls them lighthouses. The Oculus Rift had these little sensor towers, and these essentially track usually IR markers on your headset and your controllers, and these will triangulate everything. Just make sure that the software knows where you are in space. So you're not just rotating your head and tilting your head, you can actually move around your area. The outside-in trackings were interesting. They tend to give you a bit more accurate location sort of tracking. They do have some disadvantages in that you need to kind of set up a larger space. Right? You need to have these lighthouses set up. The inside-out tracking, which is getting far more popular nowadays, relies on cameras that are usually IR, cameras that are located, they're arrayed around your headset, and these will typically look outwards. There's all kinds of crazy sensor fusion going on, machine learning, sensor fusion, all that, to analyze your environment and kind of figure out where you are without the need for an external sensor. And this will typically track both the headset as well as your controllers. So these are really cool because they allow you to set up. They allow for much quicker setup. I don't need to go set up a lighthouse or sensor tower, calibrate that, and just put that on, and it'll analyze your environment. In terms of the types of experiences you typically look at, you can sort of break these down into a couple of very broad categories. You've got your seated or stationary experiences. These are typically used for things like driving simulators, flying simulators. They're also used for kind of easing people in to VR, because you've got a safe spot. You're kind of sitting down, or you're standing up in a spot, and you're looking around. These are really useful for, as I mentioned, driving and flying simulators, just because for higher end sort of things, you might have a full seat built up that physically represents what you're actually simulating. So a little, a cockpit of a plane, the racing seat of a race car. These are also good because you don't need a lot of space. You just kind of sit down or stand up. Then you've got your room scale, where you might have a few meters of space. These were really only possible once we started getting things like the lighthouses and the inside-out tracking, because it allowed you to kind of move around your space. Then there's the multi-user room scale, which is things like your VR centers, your VR arcades, the installation style things where you might have 2 to 4 friends, 6 friends in a space. You might have like things like those Vicon motion trackers that are tracking everybody's location and their poses. And so these are pretty interesting because they allow for you and your friends to get into the same space and kind of be in the same virtual environment.